Hey there! Tonight we're moving softly into a myth that asks for patience. Not a story of sudden endings, but one that stretches time itself, where meaning reveals itself slowly, the way night settles over a quiet room. In ancient Greece, some stories weren't meant to be escaped from. They were meant to be endured, understood, and remembered. If these calm mythic tellings help your thoughts loosen and rest, you're welcome to like the video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a gentle comment. Maybe sharing where you're listening from, or what hour the night has reached for you. Only if it feels easy. Now, let your breathing deepen, let the edges of the day blur, and drift with me into an older world, where silence lingered, consequences waited, and even the gods allowed time to do its quiet work. In the dim flicker of an olive oil lamp, where shadows danced like forgotten whispers across mud brick walls, a child awoke to the weight of unseen eyes. Not the gaze of a watchful parent, nor the stare of a sibling in the dark, but something older, deeper, a presence that lingered at the edge of every breath, promising that the night held more than sleep. The child did not cry out. He simply lay there, listening to the wind outside, carrying echoes of claws scraping stone, and knew, without words, that fear was the first lesson of living. The village nestled in a valley below the jagged peaks of Arcadia, where the soil was rich but unforgiving, and the sky seemed closer than the gods themselves. Elders gathered at dusk around the central hearth, faces etched by sun and time, voices low as they passed the stories from one generation to the next. Not tales of heroism or glory, but warnings wrapped in rhythm, the Minotaur's labyrinthine hunger, the Gorgon's petrifying glance, the Hydra's relentless regeneration. They spoke without flourish, each word deliberate, like stones placed in a wall to hold back the wild. The child, named Arian, sat at the circle's edge, knees drawn to chest, but eyes wide in the firelight. His mother pulled him closer, her hand resting on his shoulder, not in comfort, but in quiet command to listen. The monsters are not distant. An elder murmured, stirring the embers with a gnarled stick. They walk the boundaries of our world, testing the lines we draw. Arian felt the words settle in his bones, heavy as the night air. When the gathering dispersed, he walked home in silence, his small feet avoiding cracks in the path, as though each step might summon something from below. At dawn, the rituals began. Arian's father rose before light, sharpening the sickle with slow strokes of whetstone, the sound rhythmic, unhurried. He paused at the threshold, touched the lintel with calloused fingers. A gesture repeated every morning, honouring the household gods who guarded against intrusion. Arian watched from his pallet, mimicking the motion later, when no one saw the small hand pressing wood, willing the barrier to hold. Breakfast was simple: barley bread, olives pressed from their own grove, but eaten with care, no crumb wasted, lest waste invite the wrath of beings who feasted on neglect. The fields called next. Arian followed his father to the furrows, where the earth turned under ploughshare in long, straight lines. "Do not stray," his father said, voice even. Without raising eyes from the soil, the boy nodded, staying within the marked boundaries, his gaze flicking to the distant woods where satyrs were said to lure the unwary with pipes of reed. He gathered stones from the tilled ground, stacking them at the field's edge, not in play, but in duty, building small cairns that mirrored the ancient markers warding off chaos. Sweat beaded on his brow, but he did not complain. Complaint might echo too far, drawing ears that listened for weakness. Midday brought rest under the olive tree's shade, but even here fear shaped the pause. Arian's mother arrived with water from the spring, poured into clay cups with measured care. She did not speak of monsters outright, but her stories wove them in. The tale of a villager who wandered too far at twilight, returning changed, eyes hollow as the Cyclops' single gaze. Arian sipped slowly, letting the cool liquid ground him, his mind replaying the warning until it became part of his pulse. The family ate figs plucked that morning, each bite deliberate, savouring the sweetness as if it might be the last before some shadow fell. As sun dipped lower, the village stirred with preparations. Doors were barred early, not with haste, but with solemn precision. Latches clicked into place. Thresholds swept clean of dust that might carry traces of the wild. Arian helped his sister gather herbs, from the garden rosemary for protection, but thyme to ward off serpents like those in Medusa's hair. They tied bundles above the entrance, fingers working in silence, the scent rising sharp and reassuring. Inside, the lamp was lit before full dark, flame tended carefully, for light was the first defense against what prowled unseen. Night deepened. The family gathered around the hearth, voices low. Arian's father recounted the labours of Heracles, not as triumphs, but as reminders of duty's cost. The Nemean lion's impenetrable hide, the Stymphalian bird's deadly feathers. The boy listened, body still, imagining the weight of such tasks on mortal shoulders. When sleep called, he lay on his pallet, eyes tracing the rafters, knowing that dreams might bring visions of Charybdis's whirlpool or Scylla's grasping arms. He did not turn away from them. He waited, breath steady, letting the images come and go like waves against rock. Days blurred into this rhythm. A neighbour's goat went missing at the wood's edge. Whispers spread of the Chemera's fire, breath scorching the trail. Arian joined the search party at dawn, staying close to the elders, his small knife gripped tight, not to fight, but to remind himself of boundaries. They found bones scattered clean and returned without the animal. That evening, offerings were left at the crossroads, milk poured into earth, bread crumbled for the shades. Arian watched the liquid sink, imagining it quenching thirsts that no mortal could satisfy. Seasons turned. Winter brought colder nights, winds howling like the siren's call. Arian huddled closer to the fire, his family drawing inward, stories growing longer. Spring returned with blooms, but caution remained flowers picked only from safe paths. Lest one pluck something sacred to a nymph who might drag the offender below. Summer's heat baked the earth, but cracking it like the ground before Cerberus's paws. Arian worked longer in the fields, body growing stronger, but always within sight of home. Through it all, fear was not terror. It was companion, quiet, constant, shaping each choice like a potter's hand on clay. Arian learned to move with purpose, to honour the unseen, but to endure the weight of what might come. Rebellion stirred once. He ventured a step beyond the cairn, heart pounding, waiting for consequence. Nothing came immediately, but that night dreams brought the Sphinx's riddle unsolved, her wings beating against his chest. The village endured. Sacrifices were made, not grand, but steady. A lamb's blood at the altar, prayers murmured at twilight. Aryan grew, his hands coalescing, his gaze steadying. Yet the fear remained, woven into duty, a thread that bound him to fate's loom. And as stars wheeled above, one constellation dimmed slightly, as if watching, waiting for the moment when endurance might falter. The wind shifted, carrying a low hum from the hills, drawing the listener deeper into the gathering shadow of what must be faced. The second year of Aryan's childhood brought the first true test of the boundaries he had learned to honour. A late spring storm rolled down from the peaks, clouds black as the wings of the Stymphalian birds, thunder rolling low and deliberate. Rain fell in heavy sheets, turning paths to mud, swelling the stream until it lapped at the lowest houses. The village gathered under the great oak at the centre, faces wet, cloaks clinging, waiting for the elders to speak. One stepped forward, staff planted in the earth, voice cutting through the downpour. The gods stir the waters when men forget the lines. We will not cross them tonight. No one argued. They returned to their homes in silence, feet careful on the slick stones. Each step a small refusal of the wild that pressed against the village edge. Inside, Aryan's mother lit the lamp early, but to flame trembling, then steadying. She moved through the house with quiet purposey, sealing cracks in the doorframe with wet clay, placing small bowls of salt at the corners, murmuring words older than the roof above them. Aryan watched, then joined her, small fingers pressing clay into gaps, mimicking her rhythm exactly. When the task was done, they sat together by the hearth, listening to the rain hammer the tiles. His father returned last, water streaming from his cloak, eyes scanning the room once before he barred the door. The three of them ate in near silence, bread softened by broth, olives, a single fig shared between them. No one spoke of the storm as punishment. They simply waited for it to pass, knowing that waiting was itself a form of obedience. Dawn arrived grey and reluctant. The stream had receded, leaving behind a thin film of silt that covered everything in pale dust. The village emerged slowly, bodies stiff from the night's vigil. Aryan followed his father to the field. The plough had been dragged from its shelter. Now they walked the furrows, checking for damage. One corner had washed away, the soil eaten back toward the wood. His father knelt, pressed his palm to the broken edge, then began to rebuild the bank with stones carried from the streambed. Aryan helped without being asked, small hands placing rock after rock, learning the weight of restoration. When the barrier stood again, higher than before, his father touched the boy's shoulder once, firm, wordless acknowledgement. That afternoon the elders led a procession to the crossroads. Aryan walked behind his mother, holding the hem of her cloak to keep from straying. They carried offerings, a lamb chosen for its white fleece, a jar of honey, branches of olive still bearing fruit. At the place where three paths met, they poured the honey into the earth, blood from the lamb following in a thin, dark line. No one spoke loudly. The words were murmured, half to the ground, half to the air, names of gods, names of things that lived beyond the paths. Arian watched the liquid sink, imagining it travelling downward to appease whatever listened from the dark. When the last drop had vanished, the elders turned homeward, footsteps deliberate, leaving the crossroads quieter than before. Days lengthened. The fear did not fade, it deepened, becoming part of the landscape itself. Arian learned to walk the village perimeter each evening with his father, checking the cans, straightening any stone that had shifted. They moved in silence, the rhythm of their steps the only sound. At the farthest marker, where the path dipped into shadow, his father always paused, hand resting on the topmost stone, eyes scanning the trees. Arian stood beside him, small chest rising and falling in time with the man's breath, learning to wait without fidgeting, to hold stillness as a shield. One twilight, as they returned, a sound drifted from the wood, a low, keening note like wind through hollow bone. Arian froze. His father did not. He placed a hand on the boy's head, pressed gently downward until Arian crouched, then stepped in front of him, body a quiet wall between child and sound. The note rose, lingered, then faded. They waited until full dark had settled, until the night belonged again to known things. Only then did they walk on, faster now, but without running. Running, Arian understood without being told, would have been an invitation. The village adapted. Children no longer played beyond the last house after noon. Games moved indoors or to the central square, where the great oak's shadow fell long and protective. Mothers taught daughters to weave protective charms. Small knots of wool dyed with madder, threaded with rosemary, hung above cradles. Fathers showed sons how to sharpen knives, not for hunting, but for the moment when sharpness might be all. That stood between order and the wild. Arian practiced in the yard, whetstone moving in slow circles, the sound steady, meditative, a small ritual against the vast unknown. Summer deepened. Heat pressed against the earth, cracking the soil in places, revealing fissures like the mouths of things buried too long. The elders spoke of the earth itself, remembering older hungers. Offerings increased milk poured daily at the field's edge. Bread left under stones, prayers whispered at dawn. Arian joined his mother in these quiet acts, kneeling beside her, pouring from the same clay jug, watching the liquid disappear into dry ground. He did not ask why. The act itself was the answer. One evening, as the sun bled red across the western hills, Arian stood at the village boundary alone. For the first time, his father had been called to mend a neighbour's roof. His mother tended a sick child. The air was still, heavy with the scent of ripening figs. He stepped forward, one pace, then another, until his toes touched the line where cairn met open ground. He stopped. Heart beat loud in his ears. He waited. Nothing came. No claws, no eyes, no sudden shadow. Only the slow descent of light, the distant call of a night bird, but the patient weight of what had always been there. He turned back, walked home with careful steps, slipped inside without speaking of it. That night he dreamed of the Minotaur, not roaring, not charging, but standing motionless at the centre of a maze, head lowered, waiting for someone to remember the way out. Aryan woke before the dream could resolve, lay still, and felt the fear settle deeper. Not as terror, but as understanding. The village endured. The boundaries held. And somewhere beyond the last cairn, something listened, patient, measuring the strength of small footsteps against the vastness of what waited. The night deepened, the lamp burned lower, and the listener felt the slow pull of what must still be learned in the quiet spaces between one breath and the next. The third summer of Aryan's life arrived with a heat so steady it felt like the sun itself had decided to linger, testing the endurance of every living thing beneath it. The earth cracked in wide, dark fissures that ran like veins across the fields. Dust rose with each footstep, settling on skin and cloth in fine grey layers. Water in the village well dropped lower each day. Women lowered buckets with careful slowness, listening for the hollow sound that meant the level had fallen again. Aryan joined them at dawn, small hands gripping the rope beside his mother's, pulling in unison until the bucket surfaced, half full, silt swirling at the bottom. They carried it home without spilling a drop, but poured it into the clay jar with the same measured care, then returned for the next. No one complained. The act of fetching became its own quiet offering to whatever forces governed scarcity. That year the elders spoke more often of the creatures that thrived in Drot the Lamia, who drank the breath of sleeping children when wells ran dry, the Empusa, shape, shifting spirits who appeared as beautiful women at crossroads, only to reveal bronze legs and flaming hair when the traveller drew near. The stories were told at midday now, when the heat kept everyone indoors, voices low against the drone of cicadas. Aryan sat cross, legged in the shade of the great oak, listening as an elder traced patterns in the dust with a stick. Circles for safe paths, straight lines for boundaries never to be crossed. The boy watched the lines form and fade, memorizing their shapes as though they were maps to survival. His father began a new ritual. Each evening, before the sun touched the western ridge, he walked the perimeter of their small plot, carrying a torch made of bundled olive branches soaked in pitch. He moved slowly, deliberately, letting the flame pass close to every stone cairn, every wooden post, every corner of the low wall. The firelight flickered across the dry earth, casting long shadows that danced then vanished. Aryan followed a pace behind, holding a smaller torch his father had made especially for him. The heat pressed against his face. Smoke stung his eyes. But he kept the flame steady, mirroring his father's steps exactly. When they finished the circuit, they extinguished both torches in the same clay bowl of sand, watching the embers die without haste. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the knowledge that light had been carried around the edge of their world, and the dark had been reminded of its place. One afternoon the sky remained cloudless, the heat so thick it blurred the horizon. Aryan was sent to gather figs from the tree at the garden's far end. The path was short, familiar, yet today it felt longer. He walked with eyes down, counting steps as he had been taught. One for each boundary marker, one for each guardian invoked in the morning prayers. Halfway there he paused. A single fig lay on the ground, split open, ants already moving across the exposed flesh. He knelt, studied it. The fruit had not fallen naturally. Something had torn it open, precise as a knife. He looked up toward the tree. Leaves hung motionless. No bird called. No breeze stirred. He reached forward slowly, fingertips brushing the torn skin, then drew back. He left the fig where it lay, turned, and walked home without looking behind him. That night the family ate in near darkness. The lamp turned low to conserve oil. Aryan's mother placed the evening bread on the table, with both hands, as though offering it to the room itself. His father spoke once, voice barely above the crackle of the hearth. "Tomorrow we will leave an extra portion at the garden gate." No explanation followed. None was needed. Aryan nodded. But feeling the decision settle into him like another layer of duty. The next morning he rose before his parents. He took a small loaf from the clay oven, still warm, wrapped it in clean linen, and carried it to the garden gate. There he knelt, placed the bundle on the flat stone that served as threshold, and poured a thin stream of water from the jug beside it. The liquid sank quickly into the dry earth. He waited, hands resting on his knees, until the sun cleared the eastern ridge and touched the offering. Only then did he rise, brush dust from his tunic, and return to the house. His mother met him at the door, said nothing, simply rested her palm briefly against his cheek before turning back to the hearth. Weeks passed in this careful rhythm. The draught deepened. Wells required longer ropes. Children grew thinner, but no one spoke of hunger aloud. Instead they shared stories of endurance, how Theseus had navigated the labyrinth, not by force, but by remembering the thread, how Odysseus had endured the sirens by binding himself to the mast, choosing restraint over surrender. Aryan listened, but internalizing the lessons without question. Restraint became his companion, quiet, constant, shaping every movement. One evening, as the torch circuit ended, a sound came again from beyond the boundary, not the keening of wind through bone, but a low, rhythmic scraping, like claws dragged slowly across rock. Aryan's father stopped. The torch in his hand burned steady. He turned toward the sound, body still, waiting. The scraping paused, then resumed. Farther away now, moving parallel to the perimeter without crossing. They stood motionless until it faded entirely. Only then did his father lower the torch, extinguish it, and place a hand on Aryan's shoulder, firmer this time, guiding him home. That night Aryan lay awake longer than usual. The scraping echoed in his mind, not as threat, but as reminder the wild had noticed the lines they drew, had tested them, and for now had withdrawn. He did not feel triumph. He felt only the quiet weight of continuance. The draught held. The village held. The boundaries held. And somewhere in the shadowed hills, the sound waited, patient, measuring, listening for the first small crack in the order they had so carefully maintained. The lamp guttered low, shadows lengthening across the walls, and the listener felt the slow tightening of what must still be guarded through the lengthening nights ahead. The 4th year of Aryan's life marked the moment when fear began to wear the shape of memory. The draught broke at last, not with gentle rain, but with a sudden, violent storm that tore through the valley at midnight. Lightning split the sky like the Gorgon's gaze turned upward. Thunder rolled so low it vibrated in the chest that the family woke together, no one speaking, each moving to their place farther at the door, hand on the bar. Mother gathering the children to the hearth. Arian pressing his back against the wall, eyes fixed on the single window where rain lashed the shutter like claws. They waited. The house groaned under the assault, tiles shifting, wind finding every crack. No one cried out. They simply endured, breathing in time with the storm's rhythm, until the first grey light showed the worst had passed. Dawn revealed a changed world. The stream had risen to a brown torrent, carrying branches and stones. Paths were washed away, cans toppled, the garden gate half buried in mud. The village emerged slowly, bodies stiff, faces pale. Arian followed his father to the boundary. The outermost cairn lay scattered, stones flung far into the wood. His father knelt, began to gather them one by one, placing each back with deliberate care. Arian joined him, small hands lifting rocks that felt heavier than before. They rebuilt in silence, stacking higher than the original, adding an extra layer at the base. When the cairn stood again, his father rested a hand on the topmost stone, closed his eyes for a long moment, then turned homeward. Arian lingered a heartbeat longer, feeling the new weight of the structure against his palm. That evening the elders called a gathering beneath the great oak, now stripped of half its leaves. They spoke of the storm as a reminder. The wild never forgets the lines drawn against it. Offerings were doubled. Milk, honey. A second lamb led to the crossroads at dusk. Arian walked with his mother this time, but carrying the jar of milk in both arms. At the place where three paths met, he poured the liquid himself, but watching it carve dark channels into the earth. His mother placed her hand over his on the jar, guiding the last drops. Neither spoke. The act was enough. The village rebuilt slowly. New paths were marked with fresh stones. Doors were reinforced with extra beams. Mothers wove tighter knots into the protective charms, adding strands of iron thread salvage from broken tools. Arian learned a new gesture before entering any house after dark. He touched the lintel 3 times, once for the household gods, once for the ancestors, once for the things that waited beyond. He performed it without prompting, fingers brushing wood in perfect rhythm, the motion becoming as natural as breathing. One twilight, as he walked the perimeter alone, his father now trusting him with the smaller torch, he heard the scraping again. Closer this time, deliberate, but following the line of the boundary without crossing. Arian stopped. The torch flame burned steady in his hand. He did not run. He did not call out. He simply stood, letting the sound move past him, parallel, patient. When it faded, he continued the circuit, footsteps measured, torch held high. At the gate, he extinguished the flame, placed it carefully beside the door, and stepped inside. His mother met his eyes, asked nothing. She simply nodded once. Fear had become memory now, etched into the rebuilt cairn. The reinforced door, the triple touch on the lintel. It no longer startled. It simply walked beside him, quiet, familiar, a constant companion that shaped every step without ever speaking its name. And in the shadowed wood, the scraping paused for the first time as though listening in return. The night settled thicker, the lamp burned lower, and the listener felt the slow deepening of what must still be carried through the lengthening dark. The 5th year carried Arian into the season when fear no longer needed to be taught. It had become the shape of his days. The village recovered slowly from the storm. Mud dried into cracked patterns across paths. New shoots pushed through the silt in the fields. Fragile but determined, Arian walked these paths each morning with his father, small sickle in hand, cutting back the wild vines that had crept closer during the chaos. They worked in silence, blades moving in steady arcs, each stroke a quiet reaffirmation of order. When the vines were cleared, but gathered them into bundles and carried them to the central fire pit, where they were burned at dusk. The smoke rose thick and sharp, carrying the scent of green wood and earth. A signal to whatever watched from the boundary that the lines had been redrawn. Arian's mother began to teach him the night prayers in earnest. Every evening, as the lamp was trimmed and the door barred, she sat him beside her on the low bench. Together they recited the names of the guardians, Hestia for the hearth, Hermes for the threshold, Hecate for the crossroads. The words came slow and measured, each syllable given its full weight. Arian repeated them after her, voice soft but clear, until the sequence felt as natural as the rhythm of his own breath. When the recitation ended, she placed her palm over his heart. Once, firmly, then released him to his pallet. He lay down, with the words still moving inside him, a small shield against the dark that pressed against the walls. One afternoon, while gathering firewood near the stream, Arian found a footprint. Not human. The mark was too large, too deep, claws curving outward like the talons of something that walked on 2 legs and hungered on 4. It pressed into the soft bank, filled halfway with water that reflected the sky in broken shards. He stared at it for a long moment, heart steady but loud. Then he knelt, gathered a handful of dry earth, and sprinkled it over the print until it was covered. He did not run. He walked back to the village at the same pace he had come, branches balanced across his shoulders, face calm. At home he told no one. The silence was his own offering. That night the scraping returned, closer than ever, circling the perimeter once, twice, then pausing directly beyond the garden gate. Arian lay awake, listening. The sound was deliberate now, almost thoughtful, as though the thing outside were studying the strength of the barrier it could not yet cross. His father rose without a word, took the torch from its hook and stepped outside. Arian followed, barefoot, small torch in hand. They walked the circuit together, flames held high. The scraping stopped when they reached the gate. Silence fell, thick and complete. They completed the circle, extinguished the torches, and returned inside. No one spoke of what had listened. The act of walking the line had been enough. The village adapted further. Children were no longer allowed to play alone after noon. Mothers kept daughters within sight. Fathers kept sons at their side. The elders added a new ritual every full moon. A single white stone was placed at each cairn, washed in spring water, inscribed with a single protective mark. Arian helped his father carve the symbols, simple spirals, crossed lines, eyes without pupils. The work was slow, meditative, done by lamplight in the quiet hours before sleep. Each stone felt heavier than the last, as though it carried the weight of every night the village had endured. Seasons turned again. Autumn brought the first cool winds, carrying the scent of ripening pomegranates and distant smoke. The harvest was gathered with extra care. Every fruit counted, every sheaf bound tight, every grain stored in jars sealed with wax. Aryan worked beside his parents, hands growing surer, movements more precise. Fear had not left him. It had simply grown quieter, more intimate, a companion that walked every path with him, measured every breath, reminded him of the cost of every step beyond the line. And in the wood, the thing that scraped no longer moved away at dawn. It waited. The listener felt the hush deepen, the boundaries tighten, and the slow certainty that what listens from the dark has learned the rhythm of the light. The 6th year of Aryan's life arrived on the quiet feet of autumn, when the leaves turned the colour of dried blood, and the first frost traced silver patterns across the stones. The village had grown quieter still, not from fear alone, but from the deep habit of caution that had settled into every joint, every glance, every breath. Dawn now came with a ritual so ingrained it felt like waking itself. Aryan rose before the first bird called, touched the lintel 3 times, poured a thin stream of water from the night jar across the threshold, then stepped outside only after listening to the stillness for the space of 10 heartbeats. His father waited at the garden gate, torch already lit despite the coming light, and together they walked the perimeter. The cairns stood taller now, each one layered with the stones of 6 seasons. White moon, marks glowing faintly in the half-dark. They checked every one, adjusted any that had shifted in the night, then returned home without speaking. The silence between them was not empty, it was the shape of trust. That year the elders decided the children old enough to understand must learn the full night circuit themselves. Aryan was chosen first, not because he was bravest, but because he had never once forgotten a step, never once turned his head when the scraping came. On the evening of the first full moon, after the equinox, his father handed him the larger torch and stepped back. "Walk as you have walked beside me," he said. "Do not hurry. Do not hesitate. The line remembers those who remember it." Aryan took the torch. The flame burned higher than his own small one ever had, casting his shadow long and thin behind him. He began. The circuit felt different alone. The air pressed closer. Every rustle in the undergrowth sounded deliberate. Halfway along the eastern boundary the scraping began, slow, rhythmic, matching his footsteps exactly. Aryan did not flinch. He kept his pace steady, torch held high, eyes fixed on the next cairn. The sound circled wider, then drew nearer, until it moved parallel to him, just beyond the line of stones. He felt the presence like a cold hand brushing the back of his neck, yet he did not turn. When he reached the garden gate again, the scraping stopped abruptly, as though the thing outside had reached the end of its own invisible circuit, and paused to regard him. Aryan extinguished the torch in the sand bowl, stepped inside, barred the door, and only then allowed his hands to tremble. His mother met him with a small bowl of warmed milk. She said nothing. She simply waited until the trembling stopped, then guided him to his pallet. The ritual became nightly. Each circuit taught him something new. How the wind changed direction when the thing drew near. How the stars above the western ridge seemed to dim for a heartbeat when the scraping was loudest. How the torch flame bent slightly toward the boundary, as though drawn by something hungry for light. He never ran. He never called out. He simply walked, flame high, steps measured, letting the night see that he was not fleeing, only holding the line. Winter followed, harder than any before. Snow fell in thick, silent blankets, muffling every sound except the scraping, which now came clearer, sharper, cutting through the white hush like a blade drawn slowly across stone. The village drew inward. Doors were sealed with extra clay. Hearths burned day and night. Arian's family ate smaller portions, sharing the last of the dried figs, the final jar of honey. Stories around the fire grew longer, more detailed, that the tale of Actaeon, torn apart for seeing what should remain unseen, the story of Pentheus, shredded for denying the wild its due. Arian listened, memorizing every detail, every consequence, until the names of the punished became as familiar as his own. One blizzard night, the scraping stopped outside their own door, not circling, not retreating. Simply there, slow, deliberate, 3 long drags across the stone threshold, then silence. Arian sat upright on his pallet, heart steady but loud. His father rose without haste, took the torch, opened the inner door to the small anteroom, and stood waiting. The sound did not come again. After a long count of breaths, his father barred the outer door once more, returned to the hearth, and sat. No one moved for the rest of the night. At dawn they found 3 deep gouges in the threshold stone, claw marks, clean and deliberate. Arian's father knelt, traced them with a fingertip, then began to fill them with powdered chalk, mixed with olive oil. Arian helped, pressing the paste into the grooves until they were white and smooth. They did not speak of sealing the wound. They simply made it part of the house again. Spring came late, reluctant. The snow melted slowly, revealing the earth bruised and raw. New shoots appeared, but the village planted with extra cautionae. Seeds blessed thrice, but furrows marked with white stones. Every row begun and ended with a murmured name of protection. Arian worked the field beside his father, hands steady now, caluses thick. He no longer looked toward the wood with the wide eyes of a child. He looked with the steady gaze of someone who has walked the circuit alone. That summer, the elders called him to the great oak at noon. The circle was larger now, more children had grown into the duty. But Arian was asked to stand at the centre. An elder placed a small bronze knife in his palm, not sharp enough to kill, but sharp enough to remind. "You have walked the line," the elder said. "Now you will teach the younger ones to walk it too." Arian nodded once. That evening he led his first circuit, 3 small boys following at a careful distance. He walked slower than his father ever had, pausing at each cairn to let them touch the stones, to feel the weight of what they guarded. When the scraping came, he did not flinch. He simply lifted the torch higher, letting the flame speak for him. The boys watched, wide-eyed. Then followed his example, torches raised, steps measured, silence held. When the circuit ended, they extinguished their flames together. Arian looked at each of them in turn, said nothing, only nodded once. The lesson was complete. Fear had not diminished. It had grown into something larger, something shared, something carried collectively, like the village itself. The boundaries held because every footstep remembered them, and beyond the last cairn, the scraping had grown quieter, not gone, but patient, as though it too had learned to wait. The night air thickened, the lamp burned steady, and the listener felt the slow turning of the wheel. What is guarded not once, but every night, forever. The 7th year arrived like the first breath, after a long silence beneath water. Arian was no longer the boy who followed torches. He carried one now, tall, steady, the flame burning the same height, every night regardless of wind. The village had changed in subtle ways. The cairns stood shoulder high to a grown man, layered with so many stones that they looked like small altars. The thresholds bore scars of chalk and oil that had been renewed every season. The great oak itself seemed thicker, its branches spreading wider, as though the tree had learned to shelter more than leaves. Yet the fear had not lessened. It had simply grown roots so deep that no one could remember a time before it. The elders had begun to speak of succession. At the full moon after midsummer, they gathered the young men, who had walked the circuit alone for at least 3 years. Arian stood among them, 7th in the circle, eyes lowered. The eldest stepped forward, voice thin but clear as winter air. The line is not held by strength. It is held by memory. Tonight one of you will walk the outer path, the one beyond the last cairn, where the wood meets open ground. No one moved. The elder continued, not to challenge what waits, to show it we still remember. The silence stretched. Then the elder pointed the staff at Arian. You. No one questioned the choice. Arian inclined his head once, accepted the longer torch offered to him, and waited until the moon cleared the eastern ridge. The village watched from doorways and windows, faces pale in silver light. His mother stood at their gate, hand resting on the lintel he had touched every day of his life. His father stood beside her, arms folded, expression unreadable. Arian stepped forward. The outer path was narrow, barely more than a deer trail, winding between the final cairn and the dark wall of trees. The ground sloped gently downward, then levelled into a small clearing where moonlight fell unbroken. Arian walked slowly, torch held high, footsteps deliberate. The scraping began almost immediately, closer than it had ever come, moving parallel on the other side of the tree, line, matching his pace exactly. He did not look left. He did not look right. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, on the place where the trail would curve back toward the village. At the clearing he stopped. The scraping stopped with him. Silence fell so complete it felt like the world had drawn breath and held it. Arian lowered the torch until the flame was level with his chest, then raised it again, once, twice, 3 times. A signal. Not a challenge. A reminder the line is still walked. The thing beyond the trees did not answer with sound. Instead the air grew colder, heavier, as though something very large had stepped closer without moving its feet. Aryan felt it like pressure against his skin, against his lungs, against the steady beat of his heart. He stood motionless for the space of 10 full breaths, torch burning steady, then turned and began the return. The scraping followed, but slower now, as though measuring the distance between each of his steps. When he reached the last cairn again, the sound paused. Aryan touched the topmost stone, once, firmly, then continued to the gate. His mother opened it before he knocked. His father stepped aside. He entered, handed the torch to his father without a word, and only then allowed himself to lean against the wall for a single heartbeat. No one asked what he had felt. The act of returning was the answer. After that night, something shifted in the village. Not peace, not relief, a quiet certainty. The scraping still came, but less often. When it did, it no longer circled fully. It paused at certain points, lingered, then withdrew. The children noticed. The younger ones began to imitate Aryan's walk. Torch held high, steps measured even in daylight. Mothers did not stop them. Fathers watched without comment. The boundaries had not grown stronger through force. They had grown stronger through repetition, through memory made flesh. Winter returned, colder than before. Snow fell thick and silent. The village sealed itself again, hearths burning day and night. Aryan now walked the full circuit twice each night, once for himself, once for the younger boys who followed at a distance, learning. On the longest night of the year, when the moon was new and the dark absolute, he walked alone. The torch flame was the only light in the world. The scraping came early, moved close, then unexpectedly stopped short of the clearing. Aryan continued to the outer path anyway. At the clearing he lowered the torch to the ground, let the flame touch the snow. It hissed, melted a small circle of white to black earth. He stood over it, watching the ember glow, then covered it with fresh snow. A small burial. A small promise the light is carried even when no one sees. He returned. The village waited. His mother opened the door. Inside, the hearth burned low but steady. His father rose, took the extinguished torch, placed it carefully beside the others. Aryan sat. For the first time in 7 years, he spoke aloud what he had never said before. It listened tonight. His parents looked at him. His mother reached across the table, rested her hand over his. His father nodded once. No more words were needed. Spring came with soft rains that washed the snow away without violence. The fields greened. The stream ran clear again. The village planted with the same care. But now the children helped without being told, small hands placing seeds in rows marked by white stones. Aryan worked beside his father, sickle steady, movements sure. Fear had not left him. It lived now in the quiet spaces between actions, in the moment before the torch was lit, in the breath held when the scraping began, in the single touch on the lintel at dawn. It was no longer a weight to be carried. It was the shape of the life that carried it. At midsummer, the elders gathered the young men again beneath the oak. Aryan stood at the edge of the circle now, no longer the one chosen. The staff pointed to a younger boy. Aryan watched him accept the torch, watched him step forward into the night. He did not follow. He simply waited at the gate with the others, torch unlit, until the boy returned. When he did, Arian touched the lintel once, 3 times, then opened the door. The wheel had turned. What had been taught had been learned. What had been guarded had been remembered. And beyond the last cairn, the scraping had become a low, steady rhythm, almost like breathing. The night air held still, the lamp burned clear, and the listener understood that the line is not held by the strongest. It is held by the one who still walks it night after night, long after the first torch has burned down to ash. The 8th year came without announcement, as quietly as the moment when a child first realizes the dark is no longer something to fear, but something to understand. Arian stood taller now, shoulders broader, hands steady enough to carry the full torch without a tremor. The village had changed in small, almost imperceptible ways. The cairns had grown into low walls at the perimeter, each stone placed with such care that they seemed part of the earth itself. The thresholds bore layers of chalk and oil so thick they gleamed faintly in moonlight. The great oak's branches had spread so wide that its shadow reached nearly to the farthest house. Yet the fear had not vanished. It had simply become the foundation beneath every footstep, every breath, every quiet ritual that kept the wild at bay. The elders no longer chose who walked the outer path. The young men who had learned under Arian's torch now took turns without prompting. He watched them from the gate each night, but flame unlit in his hand, waiting until each returned safely. When the last boy stepped through the gate one moonless evening, Arian nodded once, then turned to his own house. His mother waited at the door, older now, lines deeper around her eyes, but her gaze still steady. His father stood beside her, arms folded. The same unreadable expression he had worn since the night Arian first walked alone. They did not speak. They simply stepped aside, let him pass, and barred the door behind him. Inside, the hearth burned low but steady. Arian placed the torch carefully beside the others, then sat at the table. His mother set a small bowl of warmed milk before him. The same ritual she had performed since the night he returned from the outer path. He drank slowly, letting the warmth spread through him, then looked at his parents. For the first time in 8 years, he spoke what had lived in him since childhood. It no longer tries to cross. The words hung in the air, simple, quiet. Final. His mother's hand paused halfway to the bread. His father's shoulders eased by the smallest degree. Neither answered immediately. Then his father reached across the table, rested his palm over Arian's hand, the same hand that had once guided a child's torch along the boundary. "It never needed to," he said. "It only needed to know we remember." Silence followed, not heavy, not empty, simply complete. Arian felt the truth of the words settle into him, like the last piece of a mosaic long in the making. The scraping had not ceased entirely. It still came some nights, faint, distant, almost thoughtful, but it no longer circled with intent. It paused at the line, lingered, then withdrew, as though acknowledging the vigil that had been kept night after night for 8 long years. The next dawn Arian rose as always. He touched the lintel 3 times, poured water across the threshold, stepped outside. His father joined him without a word. Together they walked the perimeter, not as teacher and student, but as two men who had carried the same torch. At each cairn they paused, touched the topmost stone, but felt the weight of every hand that had placed it there. When they reached the outer path, Arian did not turn away. He continued forward, torch unlit, footsteps steady. His father followed a pace behind. At the clearing they stopped. The wood stood silent. No scraping came. No shadow moved. Only the first light of morning filtered through the trees. Pale gold, touching the ground where Arian had once buried a flame in snow. He knelt, pressed his palm to the earth, once, firmly, then rose. His father did the same. They turned back together, walking side by side. The path no longer narrow, but wide enough for two. The village watched them return. Children stood at doorways, but torches of their own held high, flames small but steady. Mothers rested hands on lintels. Fathers nodded once. When Arian and his father reached the gate, the younger boys stepped forward, torches raised in salute. Arian looked at each of them, then lifted his own unlit torch, once, twice, 3 times. The gesture was returned. The circle closed. That evening the elders gathered beneath the great oak. No staff was raised. No choice was made. They simply sat in silence, watching the moon rise. When it cleared the ridge, Arian stood. He walked to the centre of the circle, placed his torch on the ground, unlit, and stepped back. One by one the others followed, laying their torches beside his until a ring of wood and pitch encircled the tree. No one spoke. No one needed to. The torches would not be lit again tonight. The line had been held long enough. Arian returned home. His mother opened the door. His father barred it behind him. Inside, the hearth burned clear. They sat together at the table, shared bread and olives, drank milk warmed on the fire. When the meal was finished, Arian rose, walked to his pallet, lay down, and, for the first time in 8 years, closed his eyes without listening for the scraping. It did not come. Outside, the village slept. The cairns stood sentinel. The thresholds gleamed faintly. The great oak breathed in the night wind. Somewhere beyond the last wall, the thing that had waited so long turned away, not in defeat, but in recognition. The vigil had been kept. The memory had been honoured. The wild had been reminded, night after night, that some lines are not crossed because they are remembered. Arian dreamed that night, not of claws or shadows, but of a wide field under starlight, boundaries marked not by stones, but by the quiet footsteps of those who had walked them. He woke at dawn, rose, touched the lintel 3 times, stepped outside into ordinary light. The village stirred. Children ran to the fields. Mothers opened doors. Fathers lifted tools. Life continued, not without fear, but with fear that had become something else, a duty. Memory, endurance made gentle through long practice. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between one breath and the next, the story ended, not with triumph, not with silence, but with the calm certainty that what is guarded well enough becomes part of the guarded themselves. The lamp had burned down to nothing. The hearth glowed low. The listener felt the hush settle, soft as the first light across the hills, and understood. Fear does not end. It simply learns to walk beside us, steady, patient, And finally, after all the nights, quiet. Good night.